The carriage jolted over a rut, and I woke into my own life 7 years too early, with my mother's hand still warm on my knee. I did not scream. I had learned, the first time, that screaming solved nothing. "Qinghe," my mother's voice worried already, though we had not yet reached the city gates. "You've gone pale." Beside her, Minglan adjusted her hairpin without looking up. Across from me, Yu frowned over a scrap of paper covered in her own tight numbers, and Xiaoan leaned half out the window, chattering about the capital's rooftops as though she had never watched any of us die. I had buried all three of them. I had buried our mother before that. I had died myself in a room I'd once believed was mine, at the hands of a husband I had chosen because he seemed, of every man I met, the safest. Outside the window, the capital's outer wall came into view exactly where I remembered it, gray stone catching the last of the afternoon light, and for one dizzying moment the familiarity of it, unchanged, indifferent to everything I now knew, was harder to bear than the grief itself had been. "I'm well," I told my mother, and made myself believe it enough to say it steadily. "Only tired." I spent the rest of that ride doing arithmetic instead of grieving, because grief had already had its turn and had not saved anyone. We reached the shop by evening, my late uncle's silk shop, inherited on account of some old family debt none of us fully understood, its shelves half empty, its accounts a mess. Yu Wei would spend a week untangling. I remembered this shop failing quietly for 2 years before I forced it, through means I no longer had the luxury of, into modest success. I did not have 2 years to spare this time. I did not fully trust that I had 7. That first week, while my mother negotiated with the landlord and Xiaoan explored every street within a lie, I went looking for 2 things: a shortage I remembered coming, and the ledger. The shortage was easy. A boltworm blight would strike the southern mulberry groves within the month, and silk prices would triple by autumn. "We can't," my mother said, when I told her how much of our remaining silver I wanted to spend on raw stock we didn't yet have room to store. "Qing, if you're wrong, we'll have nothing left to open the doors with." "I'm not wrong." "You sound very certain for a woman who's never bought silk in her life." "I heard it from a trader at the gate," I said, which was not quite a lie since I had heard it 7 years ago, in a market that no longer existed the same way. He said the groves near Suzhou were already showing signs. If he's right, we'll never see prices this low again. She looked at me for a long moment, the look she used to give my father before he died, when he'd made some decision she couldn't argue with and didn't fully trust. "If you're wrong," she said finally, "we sell your dowry jewelry instead of the shop." "I won't be wrong." I bought what stock we could barely afford, and spent the following weeks lying awake doing arithmetic I already knew the answer to, because knowing didn't make the waiting easier. The ledger was harder. I spent 3 nights on my knees in the storeroom, feeling along the floorboards by lamplight after everyone else had gone to bed, before my fingers found the give in the wood I'd been searching for. The board came up with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. Pages brittle, ink faded, columns of numbers beside names I didn't recognize and one I did, listed as a contact for military grain requisitions that had never, according to the entries, actually shipped. I did not understand yet what it proved. I only remembered, with total clarity, that in my first life these same pages had been the reason I died, and that I had never once seen them before that night, that Jiang Boyan had known exactly where to look, in a shop I hadn't even lived in yet, for something I hadn't known existed. That was the detail that frightened me most. Not the numbers. The fact that someone else's knowledge of this shop had outpaced my own. I copied every page by hand that week, badly, by candlelight, my wrist aching by the 3rd night, and hid the copies separately from the originals, under a loose brick behind my own bed, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, though I could not have told you why I thought that mattered yet. It only felt, at the time, like the one thing I knew how to do with a danger I didn't yet understand: make sure it couldn't be lost twice. It was on the 6th day that I met Xiaoheng. He was leaning against the pillar outside the grain merchant's office, watching the same door I was watching, and when the merchant's clerk finally emerged and hurried away without noticing either of us, Xiaoheng said conversationally, "He's terrified of something. That's the 3rd time this week he's left early." "4th," I said, before I could stop myself. He turned and looked at me properly then. Not the look of a man cataloging a stranger's face. The look of a man recalculating. "You've been watching him longer than I have," he said. "I have reasons." "So do I." He tilted his head, and something in his easy posture sharpened underneath, like a blade being turned so the light caught it differently. "You're the Liu family's eldest, the one who bought up half the silk market on a rumor no trader actually spread." I went very still. "How do you know that wasn't spread?" "Because I checked," he smiled, and it was not the wastrel smile the capital gossiped about. "I check things people don't expect me to check. It's a useful reputation to squander." I remembered, with the particular vertigo of watching a stranger step directly into a grave I knew the shape of, that this man would be dead within 3 months in my first life. An accident on the river road, the kind that happens to reckless young noblemen who ride too fast at night. I had not known his name then. I had only heard, second-hand, that it had happened, and thought nothing more of it, because I had been too busy failing to save my sisters. "You know something you shouldn't," I said. "So do you," he said. "I'd say that makes us even, except I don't think it does." We did not trust each other that day. We traded exactly enough information, the grain clerk's fear, the mulberry blight, nothing more, to keep from working at cross purposes, and went our separate ways. He didn't ask my name before he left, and I didn't offer it, though I suspected, correctly, that he already knew it. I found myself, that night, unable to stop turning the conversation over. Not the information in it. The information had been useful, nothing more, but the particular attention he'd paid me, as though I were a puzzle worth solving rather than a merchant's daughter worth dismissing. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at me that carefully. Longer, in the accounting that mattered, than 7 years. I added his name to the list of things I intended to survive long enough to understand, and told myself that was the only reason I thought about him again before I slept. The shortage made us money, not enough to be safe, but enough that my mother stopped speaking of selling the shop and started speaking, instead, of matches for her daughters. Which is how, 12 days after we arrived, I learned that Shaoan had already been meeting a young scholar named Wei Cheng behind the millinery, the same young scholar I remembered her eloping with and dying with, 6 months later, drowned in a boat neither of them knew how to sail. I found her there myself, on the 13th day, ducked behind a stack of unsold bolts pretending to sort them, close enough to the millinery's back door that pretending fooled no one. Wei Cheng was already walking away, fast, shoulders stiff, hands jammed into his sleeves. He'd clearly just been told to leave. "That's the scholar," I said. Not a question. "You followed me." Shaoan's chin came up, ready for a fight. "I didn't have to. You're not subtle. I let that land before I softened it. I'm not going to tell Mother you were meeting him. I'm telling her his family's debts are worse than they look." "They aren't." "They will be, soon enough. I've seen the shape of men like that before." It was true, in the sense that mattered least to her and most to me. She didn't believe me. She didn't need to. She only needed our mother to hesitate, and our mother, once I'd planted the seed, hesitated beautifully on her own. Xiaoan was furious with me for a reason she couldn't name. I let her be furious. Fury was survivable. Minglan's danger came from a different direction. An official twice her age who would, in my first life, take her as a concubine within the year and discard her within 3. I could not simply warn her off. She'd have asked why. And I had no answer that wouldn't sound insane. So I arranged. Instead, to be seen everywhere his interest might naturally fall. At the guild dinner where he first noticed our family's new prosperity, I made certain I was the one standing nearest the merchant's table when he arrived, and struck up a loud, showy negotiation over bolt prices at exactly the exactly right moment, so that his first real impression of the Liu family was a sharp-tongued eldest daughter haggling over silk, not a beautiful second daughter across the room. At the temple fair 2 weeks later, I steered our family's stall directly across from the rival silk house, whose owner's daughter he'd once favored, and watched, with some satisfaction, his attention drift there instead, before the afternoon was half over. Small things. Deliberate things. Enough that his interest never properly settled on Minglan at all. It worked, more or less. Too well, in fact. The official's disgraced younger brother took an interest instead. turning up at our counter twice in 1 week with excuses about fabric he plainly didn't need, buying far more thread than any bachelor's household could account for. "He's only here for you," Minglin told me once, arch and amused, clearly meaning the opposite. "He's here for the silk. He's here because you keep talking to him about grain prices, as though that's a normal thing to discuss with a customer, and he keeps coming back for more of it." She examined a bolt of blue brocade she had no intention of buying. "You're a terrible matchmaker, Qinghe. You don't even seem to notice you're doing it." I hadn't noticed, not consciously, but she wasn't wrong. I'd found his questions useful, and useful men, in my experience, kept returning to a shop that made them feel clever. Minglin, who liked being noticed more than she liked being safe, began spending time with him despite our mother's disapproval of his reputation. I noted the shift with relief and did not examine it further. I had 3 sisters and a stolen ledger and not enough hours. I should have examined it further. Everything, later, would trace back to how neatly that redirection had gone. It was Xiaoheng who first said it plainly, weeks later, over the account books he'd started reviewing at my invitation, ostensibly for the shop's sake. "You didn't just get lucky with the merchant network," he said. "You've been lucky 3 times in a row, in 3 different directions, all of them involving your sisters. That's not luck." "What is it then?" "I don't know yet." He didn't smile this time, but I have my own reasons to be careful about believing in coincidence. He told me, that afternoon, about his steward, a man who had served his family for 30 years and spent his final months decoding fragments of correspondence that named, among other things, a scheme to siphon funds meant for the northern garrisons. The steward had died before finishing the work and left Xiaoheng with warnings sewn into the lining of his own robe and no way to prove any of it. "Your grain clerk," I said slowly. "He's frightened of the same thing." "I think so. I don't know who's behind it yet." Neither did I. But I had started to suspect I would recognize the name when I heard it. By the 4th month, the shop had become something I hadn't dared plan for so soon, not merely profitable, but a place where merchants lingered to trade gossip along with silver, where 2 off-duty clerks argued over grain futures at my counter, where I could learn, without ever asking a direct question, who was buying whose silence and who was avoiding whose company. I learned to let it happen without steering it. A tea merchant complaining, unprompted, that the grain office had delayed his permits for the 2nd month running. A matchmaker, waiting for Minglin to finish being fitted for a betrothal robe, mentioning idly that a certain official's household had gone very quiet about a certain concubine contract that used to be common knowledge. I said little in those conversations. I poured tea and measured silk and let people talk the way people talk to a shopkeeper who isn't important enough to lie to. It was the intelligence network I needed. It was also, I understood too late, a light bright enough to be seen from a distance. Yu was the one who first put a name to what I only half suspected. She'd grown quietly obsessed with a dye merchant named Cao, who supplied 3 of our competitors. A man Minglin claimed to hate on sight for reasons she couldn't articulate, though I remembered exactly why. He was the man who would eventually purchase Minglin's contract as a concubine's broker, in the life I no longer had to live. "His numbers don't work," Yue told me one evening, abacus still in hand, ink on her fingers. "He buys more indigo than any dye house this size could use, and sells less finished cloth than he buys raw material. Either he's the worst merchant in the capital, or he's moving something else under the dye." "Grain," I said, before I could stop myself. She looked at me for a long moment. "That's what I thought too. I don't know how you'd know that." "A guess?" "You guess well." She didn't push it. Not then. She took her ledgers instead to a young magistrate named Hanji, who was already investigating irregularities along the southern trade routes. "Your figures are wrong," was the first thing he said to her, barely glancing up from his own desk when she set her ledger down in front of him. "They aren't." "You've counted the spring shipment twice." "I have not." You pulled the page back toward herself and jabbed a finger at the relevant column. "That's 2 separate deliveries. Look at the dates." He looked. He was quiet for a moment, The particular quiet of a man realizing he's about to lose an argument he started. "You're right," he said. "I apologize." "You should." But she left her ledger with him anyway, and came back the following evening to see what he'd made of it. And the evening after that, until neither of them bothered pretending the visits were only about the numbers. They argued for an hour once about a discrepancy of 11 tails before either of them noticed they'd been leaning over the same page for far too long to call it only business. Their evenings after that ran later and later, ledgers between them like a chaperone neither of them wanted. I let her work. I had learned, the first time, what it cost to keep everyone contained inside my own plans. I did not learn it fast enough. It was Qinghe who caught me. We were reviewing a shipment manifest together, routine, unremarkable, when I mentioned, without thinking, that the dye merchant's warehouse would be searched within the week. "How do you know that?" he said. "I heard." "You didn't hear it. You said it before Hanji even suggested the search to me." He set the manifest down, deliberately, and stepped back from it, his hands gone still on the counter's edge. "I told you about that possibility an hour before you said it back to me, as though you already knew. That's the third time." I said nothing, which was its own answer. He waited. When I still didn't speak, something in his face closed, quietly, like a shop shuttering for the night. "You're not even going to try to explain it." "I don't know how to explain it in a way you'd believe." "Try me." I couldn't, not yet. Not with Shawan still furious with me, and my mother still fragile, and 3 separate disasters I hadn't yet finished preventing. "Not today," I said, and hated how small it sounded. "I've been telling myself you're clever," he said, quieter now, and something in his easy posture had gone entirely still. "I've been telling myself that for months, because the alternative is that you've been managing me. The same way you managed your sister's matches. The same way you've been managing everyone in this family without any of us noticing we were being steered. That isn't what? Isn't true?" He looked at me, and I understood, with a clarity that hurt, that he had already decided the answer. "I'm not going to act on anything you tell me until you're honest with me, Qinghe. I mean that." He left. He did not shout, did not accuse me further, simply gathered the manifest and went. And I stood alone in the shop, with the particular silence of having been seen and found wanting. Shawan found me an hour later, and it went worse. She had heard, from Wei Cheng himself, that someone had spread word of his family's debts to her mother, word that could only have come from me. "You've been managing my life since the day we arrived," she said, "and you never once asked me what I wanted. I was trying to protect you." "From what?" "You've never told me from what. You've never told any of us anything." Her voice cracked, and beneath the anger I could hear exactly how frightened she was, underneath it, of a sister she no longer fully recognized. "You act like you already know how everything ends." I almost told her then. I didn't. I told myself the timing was wrong, that I needed more certainty first, and went back to my ledger instead, because managing a problem alone was the only language I still remembered fluently. That was my error, and Jiang Boyan made me pay for it within the month. Jiang Boyan visited the shop for the first time on a warm afternoon in early summer, before any of that had broken open, and I recognized him the way you recognize a scar under new skin, instantly, and with my whole body before my mind caught up. He was exactly as I remembered him, warm-voiced, unhurried, dressed with the understated elegance of a scholar who didn't need to prove anything. He complimented the shop's selection with real knowledge of fabric, asked after my mother's health, mentioned, in passing, an examination he'd recently placed second in when he could easily have placed first. Modesty as performance. I had married that modesty once. "Lu Qing," he said, when he finally addressed me directly. "Your family has done remarkably well, remarkably fast." "We've been fortunate," I said. "I don't think fortune explains it." His smile didn't change. Nothing about him ever changed, which was exactly what should have warned me the first time. "I'd like to understand how you manage it. Perhaps over tea, sometime." I agreed, because refusing would have been its own kind of confession, and spent the rest of the day with my hands unsteady enough that you noticed and asked what was wrong. I told her nothing was wrong. She didn't believe me, but she let it go, the way she let most things go until she had numbers to argue with instead of feelings. He moved against Wei Cheng first. Not against Shaowen directly, but against the boy she'd already half forgiven me for maligning, planting, through an intermediary merchant, a rumor that Wei Cheng had been courting Shaowen purely for the shop's newly discovered fortune, and had arranged, in secret, to elope with her and abscond with a portion of the family's silver. It was the same scandal from my first life, engineered a second time, faster, because he now knew someone was working against his patrons and no longer had patience for subtlety. The rumor spread in a single day. I watched it happen from behind my own counter, a matchmaker who'd been friendly for months, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere, a merchant's wife who normally lingered over the good brocade, cutting her visit short with an excuse that didn't survive contact with her face. By evening, 2 of our regular customers had quietly canceled standing orders, sending servants rather than coming themselves, which told me exactly how thoroughly the story had already traveled. My mother wept in the back room, not loudly, the careful weeping of a woman who still had to appear in public tomorrow. Shaowen sat by the window until well past midnight, not crying, which frightened me more than crying would have. When I finally asked if she wanted to talk, she said, without looking at me, "What if it's true? What if I never knew him at all?" Humiliated and frightened and certain, for one terrible night, that the rumor might be true of a boy she genuinely loved, she refused to speak to any of us again until morning. I had a choice: manage it quietly, the way I had managed everything else, or expose it publicly and risk being wrong in front of the entire capital. I chose to be honest instead, finally, because quiet management had already cost me the trust of the 2 people I most needed. I told my sisters everything, that night, in the shop after closing, with the lamps burned low, the rebirth, the deaths, my mother's illness untreated because we hadn't had money for a physician, Minglan discarded and destitute, Yu imprisoned on a false charge no one had bothered to investigate, Shaowen drowned, myself, finally, at the hands of a husband who had married me only for the ledger hidden beneath our own storeroom floor. No one spoke for a long moment after I finished. The lamp between us guttered once and steadied. "That's why you always know," Shaowen said finally, very quietly. "Every warning, every strange thing you've said since we got here, that's why." "Yes. And you are going to keep doing this without telling us? Forever, maybe." "I was trying to protect you from having to carry it." "That wasn't your decision to make," she said, but there was no anger left in it, only exhaustion, and she reached over and took my hand, which was its own kind of answer. Shaowen cried. Minglan went very pale and asked, twice, if I was certain it had been real. And when I said yes both times, she sat very still with her jade hairpin turning slowly between her fingers, the way she did when she was thinking harder than she wanted anyone to notice. Yue, characteristically, asked to see the copied ledger pages before she asked anything about my death at all, and once she had confirmed the numbers matched entries she'd already flagged as suspicious in the shop's own books, she said only, "That's why you copied them, in case something happened to the originals." "Yes," I said. "Good," she said, "because I think Jiang Boyan already knows we have them." She was right. 2 nights later, while we were occupied publicly refuting the rumor about Wei Cheng, Yu had, in fact, brought Hanji's independent trade records to the Matchmakers Guild Hall herself, proving Wei Cheng's family owed the merchant intermediary money, not the reverse, clearing him entirely in front of the same people who'd condemned him. Someone entered the shop through the storeroom window and took the original ledger pages from beneath the floorboard. I found the empty space myself, the next morning, kneeling on the same floorboards where I'd first pried them up, my hand closing on nothing where brittle paper should have been. For a moment I couldn't make myself stand. You found me there minutes later, and didn't ask what was wrong before she understood it herself, kneeling down beside me without a word, and setting one steady hand against the empty board, as though she could will the pages back into it. "They know," she said finally. "They know we found it. They've probably known for a while." I stayed there, one hand flat against the cold wood, until I understood fully that my only remaining proof of anything was hidden in a drawer in my own room, copied in my own uncertain hand, and that whoever had taken the originals now knew, beyond any doubt, that we knew what they proved. 2 days after that, a matchmaker who owed our shop a favor mentioned, over tea she hadn't paid for, that Jiang Boyan had quietly commissioned betrothal gifts. Jade, silk, the kind of gifts a man orders only once he's certain of an answer. I understood, hearing it, that he intended to make the proposal impossible to refuse before I'd even been asked, staged in front of enough witnesses that a refusal would cost my family more than my own unhappiness could ever justify. I spent that night awake, not planning, because for the first time since the carriage I had nothing left to plan with. I only waited, listening to the shop settle around me, thinking of every version of this exact fear I'd already survived once and hadn't survived well. Jiang Boyan proposed marriage 4 days later, at a gathering held with deliberate irony, to celebrate the shop's continued success. He arrived early, complimented my mother on the arrangements, and spent the first hour behaving exactly like a man with nothing to hide, which was, I reminded myself, the entire skill he'd built a life on. When he finally crossed the courtyard to where I stood, he did it slowly, letting every guest in the garden notice him coming before he ever reached me. Lu Qinghe. He said my name the way he'd said it the first day, warm and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and he intended to spend every moment of it watching me. I've admired your family for months. I think you already know what I mean to ask you. He did it publicly, gracefully, in front of my mother and both families, acquaintances, framing it as the natural culmination of months of careful courtship neither of us had actually conducted. A murmur went through the gathered guests, approval mostly, the pleased hum of witnesses watching a story end the way stories are supposed to. My mother's hand found mine and squeezed it, delighted, certain this was the answer to everything she'd worried about since the day we arrived. Refusing him, without proof of anything, in front of that many witnesses, would have humiliated my mother and exposed my family to exactly the kind of retaliation I'd spent 7 months trying to prevent. Accepting him meant becoming, again, precisely what I had died being. I looked for Xiaohong in the crowd. He was there, standing very still near the edge of the gathering, and when our eyes met, I understood he already knew what this was, and that whatever answer I gave next, he would not intervene unless I asked him to. I had spent this entire life refusing to ask anyone for help. I need a moment, I told Jiang Boyan, with a composure I did not feel, before I answer. I found Xiaoheng at the edge of the courtyard. I don't know what happens next, I told him. I've never known less than I know right now. My memory of this ran out months ago. Everything I've done since the frame against Wei Cheng, I've done blind. I made myself say the rest. I can't do this alone. I don't think I can do any of it alone, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say that to you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been waiting since the manifest for you to say something like that. I know. I'm still angry with you. I know that too. I'm helping you anyway. He said it simply, the way he said everything, but there was nothing lazy in it now. Tell me what you have. I told him. The duplicate pages. Yue and Hanji's trade records. His own steward's warnings. Separately, none of it was proof of anything but a series of unfortunate coincidences. Together, cross-referenced by date and name, they named every intermediary, the merchant, the disgraced brother, Wei Cheng's false accuser, as men who answered, through one obscured channel or another, to Jiang Boyan. He'll deny it, Xiaoheng said. Let him. I'll have already given a copy to Yue. I walked back into the gathering and gave Jiang Boyan his answer in front of everyone who had come to witness it. I did not refuse him quietly. I laid the duplicate ledger pages on the table between us and told the gathered guests, plainly, what the numbers proved: the diverted grain funds, the years of falsified requisitions, the intermediaries who had each in turn targeted one of my sisters to isolate my family from anyone who might notice what the shop's storeroom had been hiding since before we ever arrived. The garden went silent in the particular way a crowd goes silent when it isn't sure yet whether to be scandalized by the accusation or the woman making it. You're overwrought, Jiang Boyan said, still smiling, though something behind the smile had gone very still. This is not the place. You chose the place. You chose tonight. I did not raise my voice. I had learned from him that composure was its own kind of weapon, and I intended to use his own lesson against him. You proposed in front of every merchant family in the capital because you believed no one here would ever question you. I'm only asking them to look at the numbers before they decide you're right." Jiang Boyan's composure did not break easily. He called it the invention of a jealous rival, suggested I was unwell, grieving, perhaps overtaxed by the shop's success, reached with perfect calm to take the pages from my hand as though confiscating evidence of my own confusion, the same gentle, reasonable gesture he must have used on a dozen people before me. I had expected exactly that. I had already given the second copy to Yui. She read the key entries aloud before he could reach her, in the flat, unhurried voice she used for numbers that already made their own argument, and Hanji, standing beside her in his official capacity, confirmed that the same figures matched irregularities his own investigation had independently uncovered in the southern trade routes. It was no longer a rumor one man could suppress. It was a public accusation, corroborated by an officer of the court, in front of half the capital's merchant families. Jiang Boyan left before the guests finished murmuring, his composure finally, visibly gone, the warm, unhurried mask cracking into something closer to what I imagined he actually was underneath it. He did not get far. Within the week, his patrons, desperate to distance themselves before the scandal touched their own names, abandoned him entirely, denying, in front of the same tribunal, that they had ever known him well at all. The tribunal that reviewed Hanji's findings stripped him of both position and protection. I heard later that he tried once more to reach the shop and found the storeroom window barred and the door watched. I did not go to see what became of him after that. I had spent one lifetime built entirely around that man. I did not intend to spend a moment more of this one. The shop's reputation recovered within a month, stronger for having survived a scandal so publicly and so thoroughly disproven. Wei Cheng came to the shop himself, the week the tribunal's findings were made public, and asked my mother, not Shaoan, not me, for permission to court her daughter properly, in front of witnesses this time, nothing hidden. He stood very straight while he asked it, rehearsed, and a half-beat too even, the words clearly practiced more than once in front of a mirror he didn't own, and I found myself watching him, hoping for Shaoan's sake that he'd keep standing that straight for the rest of his life. My mother, who had spent months bracing for the worst kind of son-in-law, wept for an entirely different reason. Shaoan didn't say a word to me that day. She only found me in the storeroom that evening and put her arms around me, which was, from her, the same thing as forgiveness. "You still should have told me," she said into my shoulder. "But I understand why you didn't." I told her I wouldn't make that mistake again, and I meant it, and I kept the promise for the rest of my life. They married a year later, and my mother cried through the entire ceremony, and I did not, because I had already cried for this wedding once, in a life where it never happened. Minglan's disgraced brother turned out to be considerably less disgraceful, once he wasn't being used as someone else's distraction. He came by the shop often enough that Yue started charging him for the tea, which he paid without complaint, and Minglan stopped pretending she didn't watch for him through the front window. "He's not what people say," she told me once, daring me to disagree. I didn't. I remembered, with some private relief, that in my first life, I had never learned his name at all, only heard that Minglan had died, owning nothing, and loved by no one who'd stayed. This time she kept the jade hairpin. She wore it for their betrothal, and when I asked, half teasing, whether she'd finally sell it now that she didn't need it as armor against hard times, she looked at me like I'd suggested something faintly indecent. "It's not armor anymore," she said. "It's just mine." I understood, better than she knew, exactly what she meant. Yue and Hanji never announced anything. They didn't need to. Their evenings of ledgers and arguments continued long after the case that started them had closed, and one autumn evening I found them at the counter, with the account books pushed entirely aside, Yue teaching him to work the abacus while he pretended, badly, not to already know how. "He's slow at it," she told me afterward, with more fondness than the words admitted to. "Maybe he likes the company more than the abacus." "Don't be ridiculous." She was already blushing, which for you was as good as a confession read aloud. "He argues with me about everything. It's exhausting." "You've never once looked less than delighted to be exhausted by him." She threw a bolt of silk at my head, which I took, correctly, as agreement. Hanji, watching from across the counter, had the good sense not to say anything at all, though he was smiling in a way that suggested he'd noticed the same thing I had. Xiaohang and I did not marry quickly. We had both, in our own ways, spent our lives managing outcomes instead of trusting people with them, and we were careful, this time, to build something that didn't require either of us to control the other. He burned his steward's letters, eventually, the ones he'd kept sewn into his robe for years, not because they no longer mattered, but because he said he no longer needed to carry proof of why he'd started caring about any of this. He told me the day he did it, watching the ash curl up from a small brazier in the shop's back room, that he'd spent years treating those letters like a debt he owed a dead man. "I paid it," he said. "You helped me pay it." I didn't tell him I understood exactly what it meant to finally put down something you'd been carrying so long, you'd forgotten it had weight. He told me, once, that he liked that I no longer flinched when he asked what I actually knew. I told him I liked that he'd never once let me get away with not answering. I still keep a ledger, not the stolen one, and not its copy. A new one, for the shop's ordinary business, in my own hand. Sometimes, when I write something only I remember the weight of, the ink goes a little unsteady. No one but me has ever noticed. There is a kind of peace, I've learned, that has nothing to do with certainty. I spent one life trying to survive by knowing everything in advance, and I died anyway. I spent the start of this one trying to do the same, and nearly lost everyone I meant to save doing it. What finally worked wasn't foreknowledge. It was telling the truth to the people who loved me, and letting them help carry what I'd been carrying alone. Some evenings, closing up the shop with Yue arguing numbers at the counter, and Xiaoan's laugh carrying in from the street, and Minglan holding court over some new fabric with her jade hairpin catching the lamplight, I think about the woman in the carriage who thought she had to save everyone by herself, in secret, without ever once being caught doing it. I understand her. I was her, for longer than I'm proud of, but I don't miss being her. I don't know what happens next. For the first time since I woke in that carriage, I'm glad of it. This has been a whisper from the Teahouse. If you enjoyed this story, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what you think. We will see you in the next story.